Have you ever whispered a prayer into the darkness? A plea so raw, so desperate, that it felt like a piece of your very soul taking flight? Have you ever felt the silence that followed not as peace, but as a crushing weight, a deafening void, where you expected an answer? Tonight, we journey into the heart of such a prayer that echoed the deepest fears and the faintest flicker of faith within one solitary soul. A prayer that felt like the last breath before drowning. And the moment a hand reached down from the unseen. Stay with me. You are not alone in the silence. Her name was Ilara, and her life, once vibrant with the hues of laughter and dreams, had begun to fade into a muted grayscale. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm, not a single earth-shattering event, but a slow, insidious erosion of hope. The diagnosis had come like a thief in the night, stealing the promise of a future she had so carefully envisioned. A future filled with the simple joys of watching her children grow, of sharing quiet evenings with the man she loved, of pursuing the passions that set her spirit alight. Instead, the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, a gauntlet of treatments and anxieties that loomed larger with each passing day. Her prayers began softly, hesitant whispers of hope, like fragile butterflies taking flight in a storm. She prayed for healing, for strength, for a miracle that would rewrite the narrative of her life. She envisioned a grand intervention, a moment of undeniable divine power that would banish the illness and restore her to the vibrant health she once knew. She clung to the stories she had heard, the testimonies of miraculous recoveries, the verses that spoke of God's boundless ability to heal. Each morning she would wake with a renewed sense of anticipation, a tiny ember of hope flickering in the darkness of her fear. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks bled into months, the miracle she so desperately sought remained elusive. The well-meaning words of comfort from friends and family began to feel hollow, echoing in the growing emptiness within her. Stay positive, they would say. Have faith. But how could she maintain a positive outlook when her body felt like a battlefield, and where was the evidence of a faith that moved mountains in her own life? The platitudes, though offered with love, felt like salt in an open wound, a reminder of the disconnect between the promises she had believed and the reality she was facing. The silence from heaven felt deafening. It wasn't that she stopped praying. In fact, her prayers grew more fervent, more desperate. They were no longer gentle requests, but raw, tearful pleas that clawed at the darkness. God, are you there? She would whisper into the lonely hours of the night, her voice thick with unshed tears. Do you see my pain? Do you hear my cry? The silence that followed was the heaviest burden of all, a silence that whispered of abandonment, of a God who seemed distant and unmoved by her suffering. She looked around at the world, at the lives that continued seemingly untouched by such profound pain, and a gnawing question began to take root in her heart. Had God forgotten her? Was she somehow unworthy of His intervention? Had her prayers, her faith, been insufficient? The darkness that enveloped her was not just physical. It was a spiritual darkness, a sense of isolation that cut her off from the very source of hope she had always known. There were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when the urge to simply give up threatened to overwhelm her. She would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence amplifying the frantic beating of her heart, and wonder if this was how the story ended. Not with a triumphant miracle, but with a slow, agonizing surrender. The prayers still came, but they were now tinged with a despair she had never known before, the desperate cries of a soul teetering on the brink. Please, she would whisper, the word barely audible. Just give me a sign. Let me know that you are still there. The Silence persisted. The heavens remained unmoved. And in the depths of that silence, in the very core of her being, a different kind of prayer began to take shape. A prayer born not of expectation, but of utter surrender. A prayer stripped bare of demands, of preconceived notions of how God should answer. It was a prayer that began not with "heal me," but with a question that echoed the deepest yearning of her soul. God, if this is my path, how do I walk it with you? That question hung in the air, unanswered yet somehow different. It wasn't a cry of desperation for an escape, but a plea for companionship in the midst of the storm. And in that subtle shift, something began to change. The following days were a battlefield fought not in the visible realm, but within the confines of Alara's heart and mind. The physical symptoms persisted, the uncertainty still loomed large, but the nature of her inner dialogue had begun to shift. The desperate bargaining with God, the fervent demands for a miraculous cure, slowly gave way to a quiet wrestling with her own spirit. The silence from heaven, which had once felt like abandonment, now carried a different weight. It was as if the noise of her own desperate pleas had finally subsided, creating a space for a different kind of communication. Not the booming voice she had expected, but a subtle stillness that began to speak in the language of the soul. She started to notice small things she had previously overlooked: the warmth of the sun on her skin, the gentle breeze rustling the leaves outside her window, the unwavering love in the eyes of her husband. These weren't grand miracles, but they were glimmers of light in the darkness, tiny reminders that beauty and love still existed, even in the midst of her suffering. The Bible verses she had once clung to as promises of immediate healing now resonated with a deeper meaning. Verses about God's presence in the valley of the shadow of death, about His strength being made perfect in weakness, about His peace that transcends understanding. These words no longer felt like distant platitudes, but like anchors in the storm, offering a different kind of hope. Not the hope of escape, but the hope of enduring with grace and finding God's presence in the midst of her pain. There were still moments of intense fear, moments when the darkness threatened to engulf her. Once more, the pain would flare, the anxieties would surge, and the old questions would resurface. Why me? Why this silence? In those moments, she would find herself back on her knees, not with demands, but with a raw honesty she had never allowed herself before. She confessed her fears, her doubts, her anger. She didn't try to sugarcoat her pain or pretend to be stronger than she felt. She poured out her heart to God, not expecting an immediate answer, but simply seeking to be seen, to be heard in her vulnerability. And in those moments of raw honesty, something subtle would shift. Not a dramatic intervention, but a quiet sense of presence, a feeling that she was not alone in her struggle. It was as if an unseen hand had reached out to steady her, not to remove the burden, but to help her carry it. She began to understand that faith wasn't the absence of doubt, but the courage to hold on to hope even in the midst of doubt. It wasn't about demanding miracles, but about trusting in God's love and wisdom, even when His ways were beyond her understanding. The tension grew not from the absence of God, but from the internal struggle to reconcile her expectations with the reality she was facing, to let go of the need for a specific outcome and to open herself up to the possibility that God's answer might look different than she had imagined. One evening, as she sat by the window watching the rain fall, a verse she had read countless times before suddenly struck her with new force. "Be still and know that I am God." The stillness had always felt like the absence of God's action, but now, in her own forced stillness, she began to perceive a different kind of knowing, a knowing that wasn't based on outward circumstances, but on an inner certainty. a deep-seated trust that God was still present, still in control, even in the silence. The fear didn't vanish entirely, but it began to lose its power. It no longer felt like a consuming darkness, but more like a shadow that danced around the edges of a growing inner light. The tension was shifting from a desperate plea for intervention to a quiet anticipation of God's unfolding purpose, whatever that might be. The silence hadn't broken, but within that silence, a different kind of communication had begun. A communication not of words, but of presence. The healing Ilara had initially prayed for didn't manifest in the way she had expected. The diagnosis remained, the treatments continued, and the future was still uncertain. But something profound had shifted within her. The focus of her prayers had changed. No longer was she solely fixated on the removal of her suffering, but on the presence of God within it. It was in the quiet moments, the spaces between the pain and the anxiety, that she began to sense an invisible presence, a gentle hand resting upon her weary soul. It wasn't a voice she heard with her ears, but a deep knowing in her heart, a certainty that she was not alone. She found strength in the simplest acts of kindness from others, a warm smile from a nurse, a comforting hug from a friend, a shared moment of laughter with her children. These weren't miracles in the traditional sense, but they felt like tangible expressions of God's love reaching her through the hands and hearts of those around her. The prayers that now flowed from her were less about demanding and more about surrendering. "Your will be done," she would whisper, not with resignation, but with a growing sense of trust that God's plan for her life was ultimately good, even if it didn't align with her own desires. She discovered a new appreciation for the beauty of the present moment. The fragility of life had stripped away the trivialities, allowing her to see the preciousness in each breath, each sunrise, each shared smile. It was as if the pain had somehow sharpened her senses to the subtle wonders that had always been there, but had gone unnoticed in the rush of her former life. The silence of God no longer felt like rejection, but like a sacred space, a place where she could connect with Him on a deeper level, beyond the noise of her own fears and expectations. It was in that stillness that she began to hear the whispers of His love, not in booming pronouncements, but in the gentle nudges of her heart, in the quiet strength that rose up within her in moments of weakness. She realized that the answer to her most fervent prayer wasn't necessarily the removal of the hardship, but the gift of His presence in the midst of it. It was the assurance that she didn't have to face this journey alone, that His love was a constant, unwavering presence, a lifeline in the storm. There were still difficult days when the pain was intense and the fear felt overwhelming. But even in those moments, there was a new undercurrent of peace, a sense of being held, of being carried by a love that was stronger than her suffering. She began to see her journey not as a curse, but as an opportunity to draw closer to God, to discover a strength she never knew she possessed, to experience His love in a way that transcended her understanding. The brokenness had become a pathway to a deeper intimacy with the divine. Sometimes, the silence of God is not an absence, but the sound of something being profoundly healed within us. It is in that stillness that we learn to listen, not for the thunder of miracles, but for the gentle whisper of His presence in the depths of our soul. Ilara's story didn't conclude with a sudden miraculous healing in the way she had initially envisioned. The journey with her illness continued, but something far more profound had taken place within her. The prayer she had whispered in the darkness, the prayer that felt like her last breath, had indeed been answered, not with the removal of her hardship, but with the undeniable presence of God in the midst of it. The silence she had once perceived as abandonment had revealed itself to be a sacred space of communion, a place where her heart had been opened to a deeper understanding of God's love and sovereignty. The desert she had walked through had not been a punishment, but a crucible, refining her faith and revealing a strength she never knew she possessed. She learned that God's answers are not always the ones we expect, but they are always the ones we need. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not the change in our circumstances, but the transformation within our hearts. The ability to find peace in the storm, to hold on to hope in the darkness, to experience God's presence even when His ways are beyond our understanding. These are the miracles that sustain us, the miracles that truly heal. Elara's life was not magically restored to its former state, but it was infused with a new purpose, a new perspective. She found herself reaching out to others who were facing similar struggles, offering not easy answers, but the comfort of shared experience and the unwavering assurance of God's presence. Her brokenness had become a bridge to connect with other wounded souls, a testament to the fact that even in our deepest pain, God can use us to bring comfort and hope to others. The prayer that had felt like her weakest, most desperate cry had become the strongest prayer she had ever uttered. A prayer of surrender, a prayer of trust, a prayer that opened her heart to the fullness of God's love, even in the midst of her suffering. And in that surrender, she discovered a peace that surpassed all understanding, a joy that transcended her circumstances. The silence of God no longer held fear, but a profound sense of knowing that He was with her, knowing that He loved her, knowing that even in the face of uncertainty, her life was held securely in His hands. Perhaps you are listening tonight, and the silence in your own life feels deafening. Perhaps you have whispered prayers into the darkness and felt only the weight of unanswered cries. Know this: the silence of God is never an absence of His love. It is an invitation to draw closer, to listen more intently, to trust more deeply. He is there, even when you cannot see Him. His presence is a constant, a gentle whisper in the depths of your soul. If Elara's story resonates with the whispers in your own heart, perhaps it's because you too have heard that still, small voice in your silence. Don't lose heart. He is with you. Embrace the silence. For sometimes, the strongest answers come not in a shout, but in the profound, life-changing presence of the one who loves you beyond measure.